A real realignment and a real commitment to economic populism requires a willingness to make rich and powerful people upset. We all know that with economic power comes political power. And so this monopolists try to flex by kind of using their connections, calling up members of Congress, calling the White House. And that then leads to a very important question. When they try to flex politically, what happens? Does that bypass the legitimate enforcement actions? Or is the White House and members of Congress able to say, no, we're going to allow these actions to go forward? And that's what we're seeing really break down here. I mean, your economic populism is going to be in trouble if monopolists can call up the White House or people close to the White House and they pick up the calls and then tell the enforcers, hey, you got to stop.
Hello and welcome to UnHerd. I'm Sohrab Ahmari, U.S. editor, and today I'm joined by Lina, the former chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission under President Biden, and one of the most visible and significant economically populist figures in the Democratic Party today. She won the support of many conservatives, including now Vice President, then Senator J.D. Vance, who described her, quote, as one of the few people in the Biden administration who is doing her job, end quote. And many people on the right came to label themselves as conservatives, adopting her last name as a kind of motto that represented a wider consensus around antitrust that spanned both parties. But is that consensus still in play? In recent months, there have been disturbing signs of antitrust crusaders in the Trump administration coming under fire from more powerful figures and MAGA lobbyists in the administration. So we'll discuss that, why antitrust matters, and whether it can solve the country's deeper crises of loneliness and shattered families and general economic and social insecurity. We just had this horrible shooting in Minneapolis, and of course, I'm not going to ask you to comment on that. It's not your area unless you want to. But it speaks to these deep crises in American life of loneliness and alienation and a sense of insecurity that pervades our society. So against that backdrop, why does antitrust, this very kind of technical area of law, matter? Can competition law address some of these problems?
Well, antitrust and anti-monopoly is fundamentally about this question of concentrated economic power. And the founders who passed these laws were deeply concerned that if we allow extreme concentrations of economic power, those powerful companies will be able to abuse their power and really undermine people's freedoms in a fundamental way. And there was a recognition that in the same way that we need checks and balances in our political sphere, in our sphere of governance to prevent tyranny, to prevent arbitrary use of power, that we similarly needed checks in our commercial sphere because, private coercion is just as much a threat to people's liberties as coercion from the state. And so that's really what this set of laws, but these principles and values are about. And at the end of the day, how our economy is structured and, whether you are driving 5 miles to the hospitals or having to go 100 miles because there was a merger and the local hospital shut down, how much you're paying at the grocery store, whether your boss can push you around because they know that you don't have any other options, or whether they're actually forced to treat you well because they know you could go elsewhere. These are all dynamics that fundamentally shape what Americans' day-to-day experience looks like. And it's not just enough to have checks and balances in our political sphere. If what we want is real freedom for people, we need to make sure that we have an economy that is fair, where we don't see the type of private tyranny and private abuses of power that really can be so antithetical to those core freedoms.
So just to make that concrete for our viewers, to think of an example that came from your tenure as chair of the Federal Trade Commission, one of two both enforcers of competition law in the United States, or also the body that promulgates regulations to try to make our economy less prone to private tyranny. As you said, I wanted to have you address what you did with non-compete clauses. And by the way, what's become of your attempt to restrict non-compete clauses in employment contracts?
So non-compete clauses are these contractual provisions that basically limit the ability of a person to go work for a competitor after they leave their current job. These were clauses that started off in the boardroom, primarily applicable to CEOs and the C-suite, but have dramatically expanded in the last few decades. And so now in America, we have security guards, fast food workers, janitors, healthcare workers. I mean, people across sectors, across income levels that have non-competes in their clauses. A conservative estimate is that at least 1 out of 5 Americans have had these clauses. And what that means practically for people is they're less mobile. They're less free to switch jobs. That has economic ramifications. People's wages are depressed if they don't have as many options. And what's interesting is people's wages are depressed not just for those who are directly covered by a non-compete, but even for those that aren't. Because if somebody covered with a non-compete is less able to switch jobs, there's less churn and dynamism in the labor market overall, and that affects everybody. Non-competes have become a real tool of abuse. When we proposed eliminating them, we got 26,000 comments from people across the countries. Heard candidly just devastating stories. We heard from a bartender in Florida who shared that she had been getting harassed at her job and so got another job at a different restaurant. And when she tried to leave, she got hit with a lawsuit for tens of thousands of dollars, somebody making, less than minimum wage. We heard from people who had such expansive non-competes in their contracts that when they switched jobs, they had to fly across the country. And we had comments from people saying, I basically missed out on watching my kids grow up because I was always on the road, all because this non-compete wouldn't let me basically work on the same coast. And so this is really affecting people's economic situation, but also their quality of life, how freely they can live, what kinds of choices they can make. I think this is just one snapshot of how these forms of economic contracts and imbalances of power can really affect people's freedoms. Just to share another concrete example, and this is actually some work that I did before at the FTC and what got me interested in all of this. I used to work as a business reporter, and one of the industries I studied was agriculture and chicken farming. And chicken farming is an industry where we've seen a lot of consolidation among poultry processors, such that for thousands of chicken farmers in this country, they're sometimes dependent on a single company for their livelihood. And we saw just huge abuses of power, such that at one point when the government was asking chicken farmers to share their views of the industry, chicken farmers were too afraid to speak up. And it was such a vivid example of how threats to people's freedom of speech effectively can come not just from the government, but also through a fear of economic retaliation. And so if what we care about are political rights like the freedom to speak, we need to make sure that we also have the economic conditions in this country that are going to allow people to realize those freedoms and rights.
When people think of antitrust, they think of breaking up the trusts, and of the early 20th century. And of course, breaking up large firms is a remedy that's contemplated in the antitrust laws. So that raises a devil's advocate question for me, which is, don't we want big, strong companies in an age of industrial competition and even industrial warfare, especially with China? Is it a danger to have our companies be vulnerable to being downsized when there are rationalities that are created when you're dealing with big firms that are harder to achieve at smaller scale?
I'll say a couple of things. First, antitrust is ultimately a tool about fair competition. And we've long heard, arguments that we really need to protect U.S. monopolies to allow them to compete on the global stage. I mean, these arguments go all the way back to when the Justice Department was investigating AT&T, and you had the Defense Department saying, oh, that's going to have national security risks. I think practically what we've seen is that when the United States has doubled down on competition, including when it did so with AT&T, when it did so with IBM, when it did so with Microsoft, it actually unleashed waves of innovation because competition and requiring even your biggest, most successful companies to keep looking over their shoulder and figure out, am I going to get lapped? And then do I need to go faster? That's actually been a key ingredient for economic growth, for huge amounts of innovation. There's an age-old debate about what are the best conditions for innovation. Is it monopoly, because the monopolist gets to reinvest its monopoly profits into research and development, or is it competition? This is kind of known as the Schumpeter-Arrow debate, Schumpeter being on the monopoly side and Arrow being for competition. And what the empirical research shows is that it depends what kind of innovation ultimately. Monopolies can be good at kind of incremental improvements, marginal benefits, and innovations in that vein. But if what you care about is breakthrough innovations, paradigm shifting innovations, innovations that are going to basically open up the door to entirely new technological capabilities, those historically have come from upstarts and outsiders who are, looking at things a different way, who may not have the conflicted incentives of the monopolists, who may not want to cannibalize their existing revenue streams. So those are some of the dynamics that historically we've seen. The other thing I'll say is, competition and antitrust is one tool. It is not the only tool. And, in the American tradition, we've long recognized that there are going to be industries that are more like natural monopolies. Take it like the railroads or certain types of infrastructure. And in those instances, we have modified competition law as needed, but have then applied other types of, public utility or network rules, such as, prohibiting discrimination, prohibiting entry into certain lines of business, requiring interoperability. And so there is a different toolkit that can come into play if you decide, hey, there really isn't going to be vigorous competition. We're not going to see dozens of competitors because they're high fixed costs, huge economies of scale. In those instances, it's not, antitrust law or nothing. It's not breakup or nothing. There are other policy tools that can be used to prevent the abuse of power and make sure that those, monopolies are not abusing that power.
I wanted to save the national security question a little later, but since you brought it up, there was this recent case which got settled, controversially settled, of the merger between HPE and Juniper. These are the second and third largest provider of IT and networking services. One of the arguments that was made for the settlement after the fact, and we can get into the details of that, it was controversial, was that really HPE and Juniper are providers of IT services to foreign militaries and foreign intelligence apparatuses and so on. So who cares if they charge foreign governments and foreign militaries higher because now there's only two instead of three, so that the kind of price concern around competition law wasn't at issue here. When in fact, obviously, much of both firms' markets were domestic. The reason I bring that up is, are you worried about this kind of in this new age of competition with China and concern about industrial capacity as a key component of war-making capacity, that we're going to see mergers pushed through or monopolistic behaviors protected, and you can always fall back on, well, the CIA said so or the DoD said so, we can't interdict this or that behavior because it endangers national security?
Yeah, look, there can be valid, legitimate national security concerns. And as part of reviewing mergers, those can get raised. What's been most interesting to me, though, is that over the last decade, really, we've been seeing senior members of the Defense Department, of the intelligence community, of the national security apparatus increasingly raising the alarm about how extreme consolidation is posing a threat to our national security. I mean, we've gone just in a few decades from having over 50 major defense industrial contractors to now effectively just having 5. That has huge cost implications for how much US taxpayers are providing. It has huge resiliency implications. I mean, there was a remarkable example a few years ago where there was an explosion in a particular factory in Louisiana, and so that factory was taken offline. It turned out nationally, our entire production of a particular type of gunpowder had been entirely concentrated in that one factory. So when that one factory went out, the US suddenly lost access to this essential input. And so we've seen time and time again how extreme consolidation and concentration poses huge resiliency risks, and those themselves can have national security implications. I think, national security getting weaponized against antitrust and to try to kind of, put the thumb on the scale on the side of monopolies, That's nothing new, and you really need to have kind of government processes to allow legitimate and valid concerns to be surfaced and think those through, but not have them just override and veto very significant competition concerns. When I got to the FTC, the antitrust agencies had not blocked a single big defense merger in decades. There had just been an endless trend towards consolidation. One of the first mergers that I had to review was the Lockheed Aerojet merger. And, that was one where we worked very closely with the Defense Department. It's no secret that parts of the Defense Department, oftentimes do want these mergers to go through, but we really had to work closely to make sure that we were going to be on the same team. And ultimately, they supported our assessment that this merger was going to be bad for competition and national security concerns would not override that. So, I think all antitrust enforcers need to be wary, need to be on guard for those types of arguments.
How would you assess the second Trump administration on its own populist terms? As you know, it came in really with a real realignment that the process began in 2016, but 2024, you can look at many metrics. The share of households that earn between $30,000 and $100,000 a year that voted for President Trump, especially a lot of unionized workers in what you might call tangible industries. And a lot of it was premised on, this idea of working class republicanism or a populist GOP. Now, 8 months later, looking at as much of the picture as you pay attention to or have the time to, how would you assess that on their own terms?
It's certainly been interesting to watch, and there have been a lot of moving pieces. I mean, on the legislative front, I think if you're passing legislation that is effectively giving huge tax cuts to the rich and stripping away Medicaid, that speaks for itself. It's difficult to paint that in any type of populist brush. I think it's very much a continuation of the kind of Reagan, George Bush type, let's concentrate wealth upwards and maybe it'll trickle down type philosophy that we've seen. On the antitrust front, I mean, it's been interesting, right? Because I think in the first few months and with some of their appointments and certainly with their rhetoric, it did seem like there was going to be much more continuity than at least Wall Street and the dealmaker community had assumed right after the election. There were some initial steps taken in January and February that also signal that continuity in terms of, keeping the merger guidelines in place, keeping merger rules in place, kind of signaling continuity with many of the cases. And it was interesting because soon after that type of those continuity signals, we saw a real assaults, from the Wall Street Journal Ed Board, from kind of the chamber, just a huge increase in volume attacking the enforcers, saying, oh, this is just a continuation of what Biden was doing, what's going on here. And then we did candidly see some retreat. We saw, just going back to this era of greenlighting really problematic mergers, accepting really flimsy promises from merging companies that create a huge risk of failure with these remedies. We saw kind of pulling back cases, some of these sweetheart deals that were getting very troubling allegations about lobbyists kind of now taking over the process. And so antitrust decisions are being made not based on the facts and the laws, but based on what lobbyist company can get and how close he is to the White House. And so, I think ultimately a real realignment and a real commitment to economic populism requires a willingness to make rich and powerful people upset. Right? I mean, this is especially true at the antitrust and anti-monopoly agencies, where if you are doing your job faithfully, it is going to make some monopolists upset. We all know that with economic power comes political power. And so this monopolists try to flex by kind of using their connections, calling up members of Congress, calling the White House. And that then leads to a very important question. When they try to flex politically, what happens? Does that bypass the legitimate enforcement actions? Or is the White House and members of Congress able to say, no, we're going to allow these actions to go forward? And that's what we're seeing really break down here. I mean, your economic populism is going to be in trouble if monopolists can call up the White House or people close to the White House, and they pick up the calls and then tell the enforcers, hey, you got to stop. And that's unfortunately what I see happening from where I sit. And it's really troubling.
You're the furthest thing from a culture warrior, but as you know, circa 2020, let's say, some people call that the peak woke era. It was a time when a firm like Amazon could march at the forefront of the kind of Black Lives Matter column, and then at the same time use brutal union busting tactics against the Amazon labor union, and even in their own private memos denigrate Christian Smalls, the founder of the Amazon labor union, using what some might call derogatory language, calling him not smart and so on. At the same time, fast forward 5 years, and under Trump too, you're getting scenarios where I've seen deals or other regulatory troubles for large firms be smoothed out by this administration if they commit to opposing diversity and equity and inclusion, DEI, and basically by being anti-woke. So, looking at these two examples, and there are many others on both sides of it, would you say that culture war is something that powerful economic interests use to maintain their power, to legitimize the market power that they have?
Yeah, look, I've long been a skeptic of kind of ESG type initiatives and other type initiatives where companies are kind of making certain social, cultural commitments, but it's not changing anything structurally in terms of their own corporate governance or even their own kind of corporate power. And certainly when I came into office, I heard a lot from Republican members of Congress about the importance of keeping those cultural issues out. And I made very clear that, there's no ESG exemption to the antitrust laws. If companies come to me and say, hey, let our illegal merger through, but don't worry, we'll make some nice woke commitments, I told them that was not what the FTC did. So we were extraordinarily clear-eyed about that. It is interesting and quite perverse, candidly, that we are seeing antitrust and competition and other parts of the legal regime be used as a vehicle to advance various cultural grievances. I mean, we're seeing this at the FCC time and time again, where companies will make certain commitments to shut down their DEI projects or other type of programs, and suddenly, potentially troubling mergers are suddenly fair game. And so that is a drift that we certainly seem to be seeing. And, I'd be curious what all the people who were concerned about that when I was in office now think.
You're not a politician, but you are a political creature, and you are a partisan Democrat. What's your account of why your former boss, President Biden, and Vice President Harris failed in 2024? Because there are people rising in the Democratic Party clustered around what's called the abundance movement, as you know, which say that the real problem is that the Democratic Party and democratic governance has been too regulatory, and the answer is to try to lower prices and just promote growth in a gung-ho way. There's some things they say that I think make sense, but their critics too kind of accuse them of, is this a reversion to like OG neoliberalism from the 1990s and aughts? What is your account of why a lot of working class people went for Trump a second time? And second, is abundance the means to win them back?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ink being poured on these questions and a lot of electoral analysis and political analysis about what happened, what went wrong. And, I don't have any comparative advantage in those lanes. What I saw and learned from my perch at the FTC was that there was a surge of public grassroots support for the work we were doing. We would get hundreds of people showing up at town halls in the middle of the day in kind of Iowa and, parts of Arizona to talk about mergers they were worried about. We would get thousands upon thousands of public comments from people on things like subscription traps or, privacy concerns. A lot of these were people who had never before interacted with the federal government, who never before had kind of taken time out of their day to submit a comment. And what they would say this is one of the first times that I'm seeing the federal government be willing to fight for me economically, even when it means standing up to powerful interests. I would get notes from people, handwritten notes saying, I'm a lifelong Republican, a hardcore free market capitalist, but if you eliminate non-compete clauses, it'll be the best thing the government has ever done in my lifetime. And I think sometimes in DC, we can kind of over index on thinking in terms of Republican or Democrat or left or right or center or progressive. And a lot of those labels really break down when you're talking to regular people who are really just trying to figure out, how do I go about my life without, without bullying, with limited intrusion. And people in their day-to-day lives understand and recognize and are very smart about who are the actors that are obstructing them, who are the actors that are creating pain in their day-to-day lives. And sometimes you can see politicians of all stripes be reluctant to name who that actor is. Because we were at a law enforcement agency, we were filing lawsuits that said FTC v. whoever. And so there would be a very clear story. We sued Invitation Homes, one of the largest institutional investors and owners of single family homes in the country, because we found that they were engaging in all sorts of atrocious bait and switch tactics with renters. They would advertise one rent price, but when people signed the lease, they would be on the hook for hundreds of more dollars, horrendous eviction practices, all sorts of abuses. And so we were putting a name to the problems that people were facing. And I think that resonated a lot. I think, there's no secret that people were very concerned about cost of living. There were a whole set of factors driving that. It was very telling that, initially there was a surge in pricing during the pandemic because there were legitimate supply chain issues. As those supply chain issues got resolved, prices didn't come down as quickly. And, I think we have seen companies be quite openly about how, be it the supply chain issues, be it tariffs, that these can be very useful covers for inflating prices and just kind of blaming other factors. I think we're going to have to continue to see how that plays out now with tariffs. But I think big picture, the administration in a whole bunch of economic domains really did break with the 40-year Reagan, Bush, Clinton kind of neoliberal playbook. And I think there were really important advances made on a whole bunch of fronts, be it industrial strategy, be it competition, be it how we think about trade, be it labor. But at the end of the day, you're going to need more than 4 years to fully undo the destruction of that 40-year regime. And unfortunately, we did what we could, but it wasn't enough. And I had certainly hoped we would have more time. So, that's how I think about it. People are digesting all sorts of lessons from the last few years. I've actually continued to hear both from a lot of members of Congress, but also increasingly from people who are newly running for office, who are kind of throwing their hat in the ring. They're saying, hey, I really want to run as an economic populist. I loved what you did at the FTC. I think that's what we need. I think that's what people are hungry for. How do I do that? And so we're going to have to see what happens next year, what happens in a couple of years. But, I think there were people who wanted to say, oh, one of the reasons Democrats lost was because we were too aggressive on antitrust, and that really upset so many rich donors and led them away from the party. Frankly, I haven't seen any credible analysis that suggested why Democrats lost was we didn't have enough donors on our side. I just haven't seen that presented in a convincing way. But I think, how things play out in the next few years is ultimately going to be the real referendum.
What's your read of what abundance is all about insofar as you've paid attention to these intra-democratic debates?
Yeah. I mean, it seems to kind of be all over the place. It does seem like there is a crew of people that are very focused on housing and very focused on what are the obstacles to building more housing in places like California. And to the extent the answer is zoning reform and kind of, just making it easier to build, great, let's do that. It seems like there is a part of the argument that is about just government sometimes overcomplicating things, having too much bureaucracy, having too much red tape in ways that doesn't make sense. And I saw that firsthand at the FTC. I mean, there were certainly areas where the agency had handicapped itself. Candidly, a lot of that had been done at the behest of or to appease very powerful corporate interests that have, a major incentive to really disable and enfeeble government. And so, we streamline those processes, and to the extent we need to do that across government, great. I do worry about some of those arguments being a cover for, really weakening strong labor laws, allowing companies to abuse workers, to the extent that there are people that are less focused on the housing and kind of making government more effective and efficient, and are really talking about who do we want as part of the Democratic coalition, I think that's maybe where we need to have more of a conversation. It is really interesting who this faction is attracting support from in terms of the donors and political interests that are lining up behind it. And so I
Who
think,
do you mean?
I mean, it seems like there's some very prominent, tech donors who are very opposed to the antitrust and competition work that we were doing here. And so, I think those dynamics we're going to have to see. But to the extent that there are arguments about making government more effective, more efficient, absolutely, let's do that. Ultimately, I don't see a single silver bullet. I think a lot of the challenges in governing are really about making sure that we are using all of the tools that we have been given. When I got to the FTC, I was stunned to see how much authority lay dormant. And since the Reagan years, there had been this kind of great forgetting about the tools that we actually had. I think there are going to be real challenges with the courts. I mean, the courts have become extraordinarily hostile to certain forms of economic governing. And I think those are going to be challenges too that we're going to have to reckon with if what we want is to really be able to push for an economy that provides more fair opportunity for everybody.
Lina, last question, because I'm mindful of the time, but are there any candidates, not saying that you would endorse or whatever, but rising Democrats that you're looking at and saying, that's interesting, that they're saying interesting things, or you wouldn't name anyone in that way?
It's a very fluid situation. I feel like every week we're seeing kind of more and more people come out. I mean, I am tracking more closely some of the populists that are emerging. And it's interesting to see that it's happening across the board geographically. We're seeing kind of populists emerge in big cities. We're seeing populists emerge in rural areas. But it's interesting that that's what a whole set of people seem to be gravitating towards.
So, like rural area, would you have in mind Plattner in Maine?
Yeah, I mean, he's come out and said, I think oligarchs are a big problem, but we also saw that from Roy Cooper, who in his first ad in North Carolina, called out powerful private interests. So Osborne in Nebraska has been talking a lot about these issues and the power of monopolists and how that affects things like right to repair or how people are, able to make a living. Nathan Sage in Iowa seems to be running on these issues. Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan is running an economically populist campaign. So we're seeing it across the board. Zoran Mamdani in New York City, who's, most likely going to be our next mayor. So those are people that may not share a lot in common generally, but they all seem to be gravitating towards a core form of economic populism.
Thank you so much for your time, and I know it's precious, so we really appreciate it. Thanks for joining UnHerd.
Thanks so much for having me.